Welcome to this episode of Boss Economics World, your one-stop destination for the most incisive and satirical take on the abysmal state of current economic affairs. Today, we aren't just looking at another series of government missteps. Oh no, the stage is set for a global drama, the return of a possible second trade war ignited by none other than a familiar face, Donald Trump. Let's break it down for you because, between the government's failure to handle economic policy and the rising uncertainty facing businesses worldwide, a perfect storm is brewing. This storm doesn't just threaten corporate profits but invites an economic recession that walks right into your home, with a bill scrawled in giant red letters, higher prices. By examining recent global events from China to Europe, tied intricately to the results of the US election, we're diving deep into how Trump's potential tariff policies could lead to both regional and global economic turmoil. From small businesses in the US to major exporters in China and Europe, the forces at play are huge, and the government's handling of these crises, or lack thereof, has put economies at risk. A series of bad decisions, policy failures, and market tremors characterize this mess, and if you trust our government to clean it up, well, that would be a tragic mistake. So let's analyze from the ground up, from the moment Donald Trump's trade saber-rattling reignited, to where we stand now, on the brink of chaos. Let's reverse back to Trump's first run at running America like a business rather than a country. Tariffs, in theory, are designed to protect domestic manufacturing and increase competitiveness by making imports more expensive. In implementing these policies, Trump slapped tariffs on everything from Chinese electronics to European wines, hobbling export-heavy industries globally. The result? In 2019, U.S. imports fell by about 15%, but export-heavy nations were crippled. Take a look at China. According to reports from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, by the end of the first trade skirmish, China's export growth decelerated by almost 20%, with retaliatory tariffs inflicting severe damage on American agricultural exports, especially soybeans and corn. Farmers were left destitute, Beijing's threat looming large, with retaliatory policies taking away what already thinning livelihood they had within the highly mechanized U.S. agricultural sector. But the worst part? Most businesses didn't actually benefit. American companies simply passed on these increased costs to, you guessed it, the American consumer. Benchmarking from the Peterson Institute for International Economics reported that ultimately, the tariffs increased consumer prices by approximately 0.12% annually over the complete 2018 to 2019 escalation period. So, did the US truly win? Hardly. It was a skirmish that helped some inefficient industries like steel, but the economic casualties were far more widespread than the minor industry gains would imply. Now, saddle up because Trump's second round is on the horizon. And this is where the circular nature of bad economic policy will have a greater impact than ever before. Since the 2024 US election, there's been a sharp rise in concern, let's not sugarcoat this, fear, within the business world. Why? Because the signs point to a possible second-round trade war, but this time the stakes are even higher. Trump's promises on the campaign trail to implement across-the-board tariffs, including on imports from all BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to the tune of 100%, have reignited business panic. Business owners and supply chain managers like Sunny Hu in China and Matthias Arnold in Germany have already begun scrambling to front-load shipments and diversify their markets. Skytech Outdoor, a major Chinese manufacturing stalwart, is rushing to export the majority of their 2025 orders well before Trump assumes office. The same fear radiates across businesses in Europe, where winemakers like Arnold are gearing up for tariffs to be slapped back on European goods. The global footprint of these tariffs is obvious, the collateral damage immense. So, what's the core issue here? At its crux, businesses around the world are bracing for increased costs to remain competitive in markets they had depended on for decades. Small and medium-sized enterprises who barely survived the first round of tariffs, and had shifted supply chains at great cost, might now be forced to repeat the process. We're seeing survival instincts kick in as companies seek to absorb yet another artificial cost increase, a cost that no spreadsheet, KPI, or fintech algorithm could have accounted for. Here's the kicker, this time around, the global supply chain is already in disarray. Pandemic-driven logistics issues, inflation battles set up via central bank interest rates, and ongoing geopolitical conflict, particularly in Ukraine, make for a deadly combination. Port backups? You bet. California's Los Angeles and Long Beach ports, which collectively handle almost 40% of U.S. imports, have broken records in Q4 2024 in terms of sheer shipping volume. These ports stand as the fulcrum for a potential bottleneck crisis as front-loaded orders from firms flood in before the 2025 inauguration and potential tariff hikes. Citigroup economists project an alarming continuation into early 2025, where the U.S. risk of supply chain collapse grows 30% if congestion at ports isn't resolved. What will this do to your average consumer? Ever heard of inflation? It's about to get worse. By November 2024, U.S. inflation had been lingering at 3%, well below its 2022 highs, 9.1%, but far from comforting. Import-dependent areas, like electronics and retail, are already reeling from the imbalance in supply chains, where bottlenecks have pushed up shipping costs by an additional 25 to 30% according to freight logistics firm Flexport. Temporary band-aid measures like front-loading are putting unsustainable pressure on suppliers, causing these price hikes to trickle down directly to consumers with higher prices for essential goods. Global manufacturers are reeling. ZipFox, an online platform connecting U.S. businesses with Mexican factories, saw a 30% spike in quote requests just before the election. Concerns over China-proud producers are rising, but shifting supply chains yet again to Mexico or Southeast Asia. This means expedited shipping, higher wages due to shortened demand times, and, naturally, a markup for consumers. To put it bluntly, more expensive headphones, TVs, cars, and even clothing. According to EY Global, there's no sector safe from these cascading price increases. By December 2024, businesses from Australian apparel makers to African raw material importers were frantically asking their consulting bureaus for insight. Welcome to the reality of the modern global economy. Worse still, the economic fallout from Trump's potential trade policy isn't likely a short-term inflation bump. As businesses adapt to these whirlwind tariffs, they might find new suppliers. But remember, these new suppliers, read, non-China, will almost always come at a premium. Like JLAB CEO, Win Kramer, shifting manufacturing to Vietnam might initially seem like a prudent long-term solution. But low-profit margin businesses reliant on providing affordable consumer goods, such as $24.95 wireless earbuds, will no longer be able to absorb these additional costs. What does this mean? We're staring down the barrel of classic stagflation. For those less familiar, stagflation is the deadly mix of dragging economic growth, check, combined with rising inflation, double check. If central banks such as the Federal Reserve or EU central banks like the ECB are too aggressive with raising interest rates to combat inflation exacerbated by these tariffs, business expansion will throttle, and unemployment, especially in tariff-dependent industries, could skyrocket. We could potentially enter a scenario where higher inflation meets declining industrial production, a worst-case scenario akin to that of the 1970s oil crises, but with tariff policies at the helm. For European exporters, wine, automobiles, and luxury goods remain among the most vulnerable to U.S. tariffs. Matthias Arnold, a winemaker in the heart of Germany's Riesling belt, endured Trump's first round of trade policies by absorbing 80% of the additional costs during the early 2019 tariff madness. Relying on price-conscious customers in the U.S., absorbing costs or passing them on to buyers in the form of higher prices isn't going to work this time. Now, with Trump strong-arming not only BRICS nations but even long-standing European allies into a 25 to 100% tariff range, markets like Scandinavia and regional intra-European markets begin to look far more appealing for these exporters to hedge future uncertainty. This pivot is significant since even slight margin adjustments in staple markets like the U.S. could cripple businesses reliant on high levels of exports, putting at risk revenue shares of about 40% of their total sales in some cases. For Germany, the economic engine of Europe, export volumes of cars, machinery, and chemicals, as Germany's Federal Statistical Office reports, could see deceleration in anticipatory production post-tariff plans, pushing projected German economic growth for 2025 from forecasted 2% GDP growth to near zero. This brings us to the broader point: Trump's policies will create collateral damage reaching beyond the U.S. borders. Alright, audience, so let's summarize. Trump's rhetoric against global trade is inflicting real pain on businesses, leaving them caught between higher costs and an unclear future. The immediate fallout manifests in the inflation consumers like you and I are feeling every time we swipe our credit cards. Prices will rise because costs are fundamentally rising, primarily caused by hasty protectionist decisions that have left the global trading system jammed, bottlenecked, and vulnerable. Even more concerning, central banks attempting to ease inflation pressures through heightened interest rates will create an environment ripe for potential stagflation. We're talking about a grim repeat of economic pain that countries like the US, Europe, and industrial giants like China, and indeed much of the world, simply aren't prepared for. Ultimately, it's the global consumer footing the bill in Trump's trade war 2.0, be it through the paycheck squeeze of higher food, electronics, and basic goods prices or slower wages into a stagnating economy. The question for business leaders, small enterprises, and everyday consumers alike is no longer if you'll be impacted, but how hard. And if you think this mess will be easily fixed, rest assured, the damage Trump's tariffs, alongside government mismanagement, leave on our wallets and supply chains will linger far longer than we can afford.